Okay, so welcome everyone to another instantiation of our seminar series on games and interactive media. So we have a nice lineup of speakers again this year or this quarter. All the talks are recorded by MediaX, so you can see them also online. It takes about a week for them to come up there, so we thanks for MediaX for their support. And the seminar series in general intends to bring together people from industry as well as academia to talk about games and interactive media in general. You all know that video games have become very prominent over the past decades in our society, but games have a much longer history. And so I think this seminar series is a nice way of reflecting on games as such, but also even if you take the word game out of all these talks, it's also a nice way of reflecting at different subject matters that are relevant to our daily life and to our society, right? So we had talks about education, about health, about citizen science, and today we have one about gender and queerness. And so it's a pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Bonnie Ruberg, who has done her PhD at Berkeley on a topic on new media and gender and women's studies. She is currently a postdoc in the interactive media and games division at the University of Southern California, where she teaches game design with an emphasis on social justice. And her research interests are to understand expressions of gender and sexuality in digital culture in general, but more specifically in games and in game culture. And she has authored a number of papers on that topic. And she's also co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Queer Game Studies, and she's a lead organizer of the annual Queerness and Game Conference. And today, she will give a talk on the topic Queerness in video games, identity, community, and design. So welcome, Bonnie Ruberg.
Hi. Thanks very much for having me. Thanks very much for being here. I'll say before I start that I tend to think of myself as operating at the intersection of a few different forms of scholarship and forms of industry. So I'm at game design and game industry conferences. I'm at academic conferences. I used to be a games journalist. And what that means is that when you give a presentation, you never quite know what kind of presentation to give, because each of those spaces is a little bit different. So what you have today is a somewhat more formal academic presentation. It is written, it will be read, hopefully, in my most entertaining voice. But just to keep in mind that this is one register of doing this kind of work in games, but this could take many different forms. And I think you'll see that in the presentation itself. So, today I will be talking about the intersection of video games and LGBT issues. Specifically, I'll be exploring video games from the perspective of queer studies and placing games in dialogue with formulations of queerness. It might sound counterintuitive, given the long history of homophobia in games and games culture, to think about games in this way, but I'm going to argue that LGBT issues are in fact central to video games, central to games as a medium, and I'm going to demonstrate how games themselves, even when they seem to include no queer content, can be understood as queer. I'll start by introducing these interrelated concepts of queerness and games. Then I'm going to contextualize them within the queer games movement. From there, I'll make the case for the importance of locating modes of queerness in games that go beyond representation. And to model this kind of interpretation, which is a sort of bridge between queer studies and game studies, I'll focus on 3 games, looking at the queerness that you can unearth in these 3 games that seem straight, whatever straight might mean for a game. And these readings will demonstrate how queerness can operate in games on a fundamental level, on a structural level. Together, these games and these opportunities for queer experience will demonstrate for you that queerness in video games is not a niche issue, it's not a minority issue. To the contrary, queerness represents a powerful framework through which to reinterpret and reclaim video games of all kinds. The insights that emerge from these readings, reading through the queer lens, also testify to the importance of attending to the body and its desires in the study of emerging media and digital cultures more broadly. So let's start by unpacking these terms, queerness and video games. What is queerness, and how does the word queer differ from gay or LGBT? So for many of you who work on queer issues, this distinction might already be very familiar, But queerness in games is a very new topic. It's a very new area for games, so I think it bears articulating what queerness might mean. Whereas LGBT shorthands a specific set of identities, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer operates as an umbrella term. It encompasses all forms of non-normative gender and sexual expression. It was originally used as a pejorative, but now queer has been widely reclaimed. Today, queerness is as much an ethos as a marker of identity. For some, that ethos is joyful and utopian. For others, it's fierce and rebellious. Like a soap bubble, this is an image I really like a soap bubble, queerness shimmers, resplendent but impossible to grasp. At its most basic, queerness is the desire to live life otherwise, to reject the dominant norm. Queerness is, and this is the definition I want to sort of put in your head, queerness is desiring, being, or in this case, playing differently. So if that's queerness, what are video games? This is another question that seems simple, but it actually has a complicated answer. So figuring out what does or doesn't count as a video game has been the subject of a lot of discussion in game studies over the decade, and in games culture as well. Although those who study games have likely tired of this debate, it's important to note that the parameters by which the medium is defined are neither objective nor apolitical. Attempts to police the definition of video games often reinscribe pre-existing biases related to gender, race, and class. For my part, I use the term video games inclusively to refer to all interactive digital media experiences that understand themselves as games. Such games can be found on a variety of platforms, including home consoles, personal computers, handheld systems, arcade machines, mobile phones, social media, and increasingly virtual reality devices. They span a wide array of genres. Some are developed by large AAA studios, others by independent studios, and still more by individuals. I'm going to be talking about video games here, but I don't draw a hard line between digital and non-digital play. To answer this question, what are video games, is also to declare one's own position within the field of game studies. Early game scholarship was marked by clashes between narratology and ludology, between the idea of games as stories and games as play. But like many scholars today, I see video games as amalgams, made up of imagery, narrative, rules, and interactivity. Like queerness, games can only be properly understood in their dynamic multiplicity. So queerness and games together. Apart from these sort of messy ontologies, it might appear that queerness and video games are actually antithetical. Since the development of the very first digital game more than 50 years ago, the medium has been dominated by straight, white, cisgender men. That's just a fact that we're confronting. This is true equally of those who make games as it is of those who play them. At times, games culture has been openly hostile towards women, queer people, and people of color. Within games themselves, diverse characters have long gone dramatically underrepresented. For decades, gay or gender non-normative characters were largely excluded from games. While LGBT guilds in virtual worlds like World of Warcraft provided these small pockets of queer community, and pioneering figures like Danny Barry increased awareness for transgender developers, queer players still found themselves largely erased by the medium that they loved, until recently. Over the last 3 years, video games have been experiencing a seismic shift, the eruption of a subterranean pressure that has been building over decades. Gender, sexuality, and to a lesser extent, race have become central talking points in public discussions of games, the games industry, and games culture. Slowly but surely, diversity is coming to video games, and it's the champions of queerness who are leading the charge. So this is what I call the queer games movement. The queer games movement describes a rapidly growing, if not entirely unified, community of game makers, cultural critics, and scholars working together to imagine a new future for video games, one in which diverse identities play a central role. The work that emerges from this movement interweaves critical thinking and creative production. Since 2012, a veritable wave of independent queer games has crashed upon the North American game scene. Some of these games, like Gone Home or Coming Out on Top, tell tales of queer romance. Others, like Read Only Memories or Undertale, integrate queer and gender non-normative characters into their game worlds. A huge number of games have also been developed by individual queer game makers, like Anna Anthropy or Maddie Bryce, who've used these accessible development tools to explore topics like gender transition, BDSM, and polyamory through play. Meanwhile, communities of queer players are rapidly growing. GamerX, which just happened a few weeks ago in San Jose, attracts about 2,500 attendees each year. That's a gay gaming expo. Large studios are increasingly including diverse characters in their games. And on the academic front, the subfield of queer game studies, of which I'm proud to be a part, which is exemplified by the work at the annual Queerness and Games conference we run up at Berkeley each year, that subfield is blossoming. So this is an exciting time to be working on queer games, but it's also a frightening one. As games have begun to diversify, the pushback from reactionary gamers has drastically intensified. Many women who design or publicly comment on games have found themselves the subjects of vicious, misogynistic online attacks. Simply speaking the name of this ongoing hate campaign can bring down its wrath. I hope you haven't encountered this, but if you have my sympathy. It's no coincidence that such acts of aggression come at the same moment as the rise of diversity in games. The status quo is being unsettled, and video games are changing. With this change in video games themselves comes a valuable opportunity to shift how we look at games. So I've just told you this one narrative, this one way of understanding queerness in games, and that's the narrative of how queerness has finally come to video games, right? But I want to also tell you a counter-narrative. And that counter-narrative is about how video games have always been queer. Most of the discussions of LGBT issues in video games focus on representation, whether games include queer characters, queer romance, whether queer players are welcome in game spaces. Representation of this sort is immensely important. Ensuring that LGBT subjects have a visible place in this widely popular art form is nothing less than a matter of social justice. But locating the queerness inherent in video games themselves requires thinking about queerness beyond representation. It requires thinking about queerness as an ethos, about queerness as a way of being differently. The idea of queerness in games beyond representation has been taken up by designers like Colleen Macklin and Naomi Clark, who use their creative work to explore queer game mechanics. I approach this topic a little bit differently. I approach it from the perspective of a queer studies scholar and also from the perspective of a queer player. Queerness operates in video games in many modes. It can be a mode of design, a mode of interpretation, a mode of play. It can be an aesthetic, a way of controlling the body, or an intimate relationship between player and game. When I talk about queer games, then, I'm not just talking about games that represent LGBT people. I'm talking about queerness as a quality of games themselves. So to demonstrate how this queerness beyond representation idea manifests in games, I've chosen 3 games from an infinite number of possibilities, 3 games with no explicitly queer content, each more seemingly heteronormative than the last, and each more fundamentally queer. Together, they represent different genres, different modes of production, and this attests to the relevance of queerness to a wide range of games. Some of these games are going to seem silly or absurd, but remember that absurdity, too, is a tool in the work of playing queer. So the first game I want to talk to you about is called Realistic Kissing Simulator. Created in 2014 by indie game designers Jimmy Andrews and Lauren Schmidt, Realistic Kissing Simulator is a short, small-scale game in which 2 players, represented by these purple and blue faces, stand together before the same keyboard and interact using their impossibly long, floppy tongues. Andrews and Schmidt describe the game as goalless. And indeed, Realistic Kissing Simulator gives its players no indication of what they should try to accomplish by poking and prodding and licking one another. What the game does emphasize, though, is consent. On the opening screen, one player must ask the other, "Would you like to kiss me?" And the gameplay will not begin unless the second player agrees. The game ends when a kisser fully retracts their tongue, signaling that they would like to end the kiss. Realistic Kissing Simulator is not without its aggressive elements, however. Players can poke each other in the eye or force their way into each other's mouths. In theory, the game is collaborative, but players often shift into a competitive mode, attempting to outpoke or outpenetrate their partner. So I think when we talk about games, it's important to see them as moving interactive objects, not just as still images. So for the other two games, I'm going to show you short videos, but I wasn't actually very happy with the videos that I was encountering online, and I didn't want to sit there and just play it by myself because that's not true to this two-player experience. So if someone's feeling up to it, if two people are feeling up to it, I'm actually going to briefly invite you up front to give this a try. We've got one, second volunteer. We've got two, come on up. So if one presses A and Z and the other up and down. Sorry, it's the resolution is making it a little bit hard to see. At the same time. Oh, okay. Yeah, there you go. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Okay, thank you to our volunteers. So of the games that I'm discussing here, Realistic Kissing Simulator wears its queerness most clearly on its sleeve, at least in one sense. The game includes no explicitly LGBT content. We don't really have sufficient visual cues to figure out what genders these two characters might be. But the very fact of this gender ambiguity marks Realistic Kissing Simulator as queer, especially in contrast to the pervasiveness of gender stereotyping found in most video games. This game leaves space for players to project gender onto their characters, or to accept the absence of gender as a notably queer precondition for play. Yet the queerness of Realistic Kissing Simulator goes beyond its character design and into its mechanics, the rules and the systems of its interactivity. Consent, for instance, is a queer mechanic. Asking players to consent communicates, through play, values like mutual respect. Unlike so many other games that invite players to act upon each other without thinking, this game insists that players first reflect on their decision. It was interesting to see that there wasn't a ton of communication between the two of you, right? But there's still a kind of back and forth as you figure out the system. So here the language or the imagery from consent culture establishes new models for interpersonal relationships in games. The game also fosters a queer intimacy between players. This is another thing that I feel like I saw between you. So whereas most multiplayer games are designed for each player to use a different controller or via the internet to play on different computers, Realistic Kissing Simulator requires players to stand close together and share the same interface. While they entangle and disentangle their tongues on screen, they may also feel the awkwardness of the game in their nearly touching bodies. The result is, I think, nerve-wracking, but also maybe a little erotic in a queer sort of way. The game's aimless, silly grotesquerie casts onto these off-screen bodies a reflection of the erotics on screen, an erotics that defies the normative logic of desire. Right? So if that logic tells us we're trying to reach the goal, a goal of pleasure, this game is without goal. However, this game's most compelling engagement with queerness lies in its relation to realism. Despite the game's title, the kissing that we see here looks very little like real kissing. These tongues extend, they waggle, not to mention that this does not fit with our culturally determined idea of what good kissing etiquette looks like. Right? Interpreted this way, the game seems like a surrealist joke. This idea of these absurd body parts in motion, and it calls itself realistic. So in that way, it has a queerness in the refusal to sanctify the real, to say that we should think of the real as a goal, right? It destabilizes the notion of realness, which is used to police gender and sexual identity, and it also destabilizes the notion of a realistic simulation. This is an entire genre of games. That's the ideal to which a lot of sim games aspire. So flight sims, racing sims, dating sims, they want to be realistic. At the same time, there's something honestly realistic about this game. It draws its charge from its resonance with something real in the experience of embodied intimacy. The game parodies the idea of the idealized scene of the romantic kiss. The two subjects peer into each other's exposed eyeballs in a send-up of two lovers lost in each other's gaze. The graceful, passionate locking of lips becomes the awkward mashing of tongues, suggesting that kissing, real kissing, is itself already queer, strange and messy and without purpose. But I think ultimately the tone of this game isn't mocking. It's poking fun, but it's also celebrating something. It's celebrating this kind of queer intimacy because it encourages you to linger here. It encourages players to linger in this colorful, ambiguous space. And even though this is just one game, and a kind of unusual game at that, I think it successfully demonstrates one of the primary modes of queerness in games, and that's queer game design. Even without representing same-sex romance, it communicates queer values through its mechanics, and it shows us that diverse games don't have to be serious or heavy-handed, that there's also space for this strange and silly pleasure. The queerness of this second game, which is called Octodad, Dadliest Catch. This is one of my very favorite games in the universe. This queerness is maybe less readily apparent, but it's no less fundamental. Like Realistic Kissing Simulator, Octodad is a recently released indie title. It's developed by a studio called Young Horses. It's larger in scope than Realistic Kissing Simulator, but it also speaks to a different audience. So whereas Andrews and Schmidt's game has been shown primarily at alternative game events like the Queerness in Games Conference, Octodad has become a cult hit with a subset of traditional gamers. However, Octodad is also deeply queer, even if most of its players don't recognize it as a queer game. So loving father, caring husband, secret octopus. This is Octodad's tagline and the premise of its game. Players play as an octopus, posing as a human man who is trying desperately to convince those around him, and most notably his family, that he's a normal suburban dad. Has anyone played this game? Okay. Nice. In order to progress, players have to complete everyday dadly tasks, such as mowing the lawn and flipping burgers, without arousing suspicion. This is much harder than it sounds, however. Players control each of Octodad's tentacles, which stand in for his arms and legs, individually. The locomotion that results looks misfit to the human world, to say the least. Basic actions like walking or picking up objects become feats of flailing contortion. Let me show you just a little bit of what this looks like in action. So in this scene, this is the first scene of the game, and Octodad is on his way to marry his human wife. So he's trying to get down the aisle to get married. So in terms of genre, Octodad is a hybrid. It's part adventure game, part stealth game, part physics game. But the game also challenges these basic categories. Its core mechanics are stealth-based, so you're trying to move without being seen, and you see these sight lines, right, the dotted sight lines. But it also questions the idea of stealth. Most stealth games are about assassins or spies or soldiers who are sneaking in order to kill. These games are dark and serious and sincere in the fantasies of mastery they offer, mastery of visibility, mastery of knowability. Octodad, by contrast, is funny and lighthearted, and its rendition of stealth is absurd. So it takes a really considerable suspension of disbelief for us to believe that this octopus, clearly poured into a suit, is not being noticed by the people around him, right? And part of the game's humor comes from this. It comes from the idea that stealth in a game world is ridiculous, right? Because of course a game sees you because a game is built for you. In spirit, Octodad draws more from its roots in physics games. And physics games, I think, are a really fascinating genre. They've actually gotten very little attention from scholars, but they're really rich with these embodied metaphors. So some physics games look very different than this. For example, Angry Birds, which is arguably the most popular video game on the planet, is a physics game. But they all share a focus on the mechanisms of physicality. They're interested in gravity, bounce, stretch, how bodies move. Octodad belongs to a subgenre that I call body physics games, so body and physics, in which the body becomes the site of play. The most popular body physics games, like QWOP, translate the human form into an uncooperative collection of moving parts. The pleasure of these games lies in the thrilling discomfort of confronting the body in pieces. Octodad 2 privileges chaos. The game revels in surrounding players with objects, like each of these posts, that they are sure to topple as they wriggle through the room. So where's the queerness in Octodad? On one level, it's about genre. It's about splicing. It's about revealing the illogic of what we usually call game logic, and that's the conventions that structure what we expect from games. On another level, Octodad's queerness can be found in the game's embrace of awkward body physics. While so many video games invite players to feel superhuman, super fast or super powerful, Octodad challenges its players to seem simply human. It denaturalizes the idea of the natural body, highlighting the performative nature of normalcy and gesturing towards the place of differently abled bodies in games. So one topic that's really not being talked about enough yet is, for example, disability studies in games. But the full queerness of Octodad becomes apparent only when we consider these mechanics in dialogue with the story. So let's look back at this image here. Octodad wants to be a loving father and caring husband. In one scene, he attempts to take his wife on a romantic date. You can imagine that doesn't go very well. In another, he has to prove to his son that he's as good at basketball as the boy's hero, whose name is Sports Johnson. Each of these objectives relates to performing straight masculinity. The player is playing at heteronormativity. Octodad's performance of human fatherhood reads like a kind of drag, the octopus in the man's clothing. Right? And this in turn queers the image of Octodad's middle-class, 1950s-esque nuclear family. And this family portrait of mother, son, daughter, and octopus raises questions of futurity and reproductivity that call to mind, for example, thinkers like Lee Edelman and Jose Munoz who think about queer futurity. Whose kids are these? Has an octopus fathered human children? This image of Octodad with his impossible family recalls images of same-sex couples with their children and the similar questions that are raised. Whose kids are these? And how are they biologically possible? The act of playing Octodad also resonates with queer experiences of visibility. At moments, the game suggests that Octodad is an octopus on the down low, a term used originally and not unproblematically to describe an African-American culture of clandestine sex between men. Octodad is indeed leading a double life, but in the game's final moments, when his wife finally learns his secret, she's actually relieved. She says, I thought it was something far worse. So he's been acting strange, and she says, oh, you're just an octopus. I thought it was something far worse. What would be far worse? An affair, presumably, And given the game's emphasis on the precarious foundations of straight coupling, most likely a queer one. But Octodad is not an octopus on the down low. He is instead engaging in another queer-coded experience, and that's the attempt to pass. Passing has also historically emerged from discussions of race, but it has also come to be used when talking about sexuality and gender, so to pass as straight or to pass as cisgender. Octodad is a game about passing, but we're talking about passing for human. The procedural rhetoric of the stealth game here acts as a metaphor for trying to pass undetected under the critical eye of heteronormativity. So here, Octodad is showing us the capacity of games not just to represent difference, but to invite players to inhabit that difference. The game may seem goofy, but it can also be profoundly moving for queer players, precisely because it offers this point of embodied identification. What it feels like to play Octodad, like a sea creature flailing on land, is also often what it feels like to be queer. A misfit subject in an unruly body navigating a world that is not your own. So this third and final game demonstrates something a little bit different. It demonstrates how all games can, in their own way, be queer, even if they have no characters whatsoever, let alone LGBT characters. It also models how this new way of thinking about games in dialogue with queer theory can bring something new out of the medium we haven't seen before. So this is Burnout Revenge. Burnout Revenge is a popular racing series, or popular racing game from 2004. It's part of the Burnout Racing series. Burnout games are undeniably mainstream. They come from a big budget AAA studio. They appeal to the core demographic of male gamers. As a genre, racing games tend to be as straight and as macho as they come. They feature fast cars, often with scantily clad women draped across them. And they're structured around that analog for neoliberal success, driving in circles to be the first one to cross the finish line. To say that racing games generally have no queer content is an understatement. The Burnout games are different from other racing games in one key way, though. Whereas most racing games emphasize impressive cars and realistic driving physics, the Burnout games focus on the crash. Not the thrill of winning, but the blaze of glory of explosions. Like all Burnout games, Burnout Revenge has a sort of primary racing mode, a main racing mode that focuses on causing destruction to other cars, but there's also a crash mode. And the goal of crash mode is to cause the most damage possible. After players select a car, the game shoots them speeding down a busy city street. Ideally, players stay unharmed just long enough to find the perfect spot for a crash. A well-calculated leap off an overpass might, for example, land the player's car smack into the side of a semi-truck. This truck, now stopping on a bustling highway, swipes other cars, causing a pileup of screeches and explosions. Car after car, seemingly unconcerned about the danger, plow into the truck, compelled by the logic of a game world designed and destined for destruction. Crashing in Burnout is an aesthetic and sensory pleasure. In the moments leading up to the crash, the raucous, punk-inspired soundtrack adds aural adrenaline. The game borrows cinematic techniques, like long tracking shots showing the cityscape that you're about to destroy, to increase the sort of drama and excessive pleasure of the game, right? To create a spectacle. Burnout takes the very thing that players are supposed to avoid in racing games, namely losing, and transforms that into an achievement. So let's look at an example of crash mode. So you saw how at the end there was actually a second layer of opportunity for making a bigger crash. There was the moment where the player could press the B button, and that's for a second tier of explosion on top of the initial crash. In the face of gamification and the push to make real life winnable, Burnout Revenge offers a much-needed alternative model for what failure might look like in games. Failure, in fact, is one of the key pivots between contemporary queer theory and games. In 2011, queer theorist Jack Halberstam published his book, The Queer Art of Failure. In this book, he argues that failure, because it rejects hegemonic notions of success, should be understood as queer. At the very same time, game studies scholar Jesper Juul was writing a book with a strikingly similar title called The Art of Failure. Drawing from a wide-reaching survey, Juul contends that failure is a key, if often overlooked, component of all video games. Considered together, these two assertions, right, that failure is queer and failure is fundamental to games, together they suggest that games themselves can be seen as queer by nature. But Burnout supports this and complicates it. The game serves as an argument for the queer pleasure of failing in games. And in doing so, it poses a valuable challenge to the hegemony of fun, a sort of personal vendetta against fun. Juul insists that while failure is fundamental to games, no one enjoys failing, and that failure must be overcome to achieve the experience players are striving for, notably accomplishment. But in Burnout, failure is what's fun. Fun itself gets queered. It becomes masochistic and self-destructive. There are no people in Burnout, you may have noticed. There's no one in the cars, there's no one on the street. So your car comes to stand in for your body. And when the car gets smashed up and bruised, it's a stand-in for the player's body. One of the biggest problems with how video games are imagined today, by gamers but also by designers, is the underlying assumption that games should be fun, first and foremost. This assumption shuts down critique. We often hear the argument, games are just for fun. We can't talk about them in this way. It also promotes normative values. Whose fun are we talking about? By contrast, Burnout makes the valuable argument that fun can be queer if we're willing to shift our notions about what fun means. At the same time, the game gestures towards the limits of queer failure. In Burnout, players fail in just the way the game prompts them to. So there's an important distinction to be made here between failing toward a game system or failing against a game system. So failing sort of in the way the game incentivizes you to, or failing against those incentives. In crash mode, players win when they fail. At the same time, the cultural expectations outside the game dictate that driving successfully does not actually mean catapulting into a semi-truck. When crashing in a blaze, players both conform to and reject normative logics of success, one belonging to games, the other to the social context in which games are played. More than failure itself, the queerness at the heart of Burnout lies in the struggle for power between player and the game, a struggle made visible through the mechanics of this particular game, but which operates in games more broadly. The name for the struggle is interactivity. If you are someone who talks about games and thinks about games, you know that interactivity is traditionally talked about as the core element of what makes a game different from other media forms. Commonly, interactivity is characterized and celebrated as the invitation to infinite choice and infinite agency. In a game, as opposed to a movie, players can theoretically do whatever they want. But in truth, no game offers infinite choices. The ways in which players can interact are highly structured, and often the game recognizes only a very limited selection of choices as legitimate interactions. This itself is a queer relationship, right? I don't mean to say that this is bad, that interactivity is more limited than we think. I think this is itself a site of queer pleasure. This is a queer relationship, this constantly shifting dialectic between domination and freedom, a kind of kinky interplay into which players enter each time they sit down with the game. So together, these games model a queerness that's more than representational. It's found in games' very systems, in the body, in the phenomenological experience of play. So I want to emphasize that these games, while they serve as, I think, particularly helpful illustrations, they're not exceptional. They make the case that queerness can exist in many forms and many genres, but unearthing the queerness in these games does not fix the problem of their representational politics. What it does do is shift the narrative about who can lay claim to games and whose experiences games give voice to. This is an exciting time for queer games. But it's not just a moment for new things. It's also a moment for reclaiming a history. Long before the queer games movement, video games have been queer. We queer players are building new games, building a new place for ourselves in games, but we've also always been here. And I think it's a mistake to think that queer people have just come to video games. We've been here for a long time. We have always belonged in games, in fact, even if we weren't made to feel like we belonged, because video games have always been queer. So to sum up in conclusion, here I have mapped the intersections of queerness and video games, demonstrated how games can communicate queerness through their ludic structures, as well as through the subjects they represent. After overviewing creative and scholarly work currently emerging from the queer games movement, I looked at the mechanisms of queerness in 3 games with no explicitly queer content. Drawing from these games, I delineated ways in which a video game might be understood as queer. I offered models of queerness. I offered these models of queerness not just as comprehensive categories, but as starting points. So this is not a full model of what queerness in games can be. This is a sort of launching point, with the hope of inspiring future inquiry. Reframing games through queerness has wide-reaching implications for game studies and queer studies alike. Throughout much of its history, the academic study of games has been divided into either its formal or its cultural elements. Here, queerness serves as a bridge, modeling a framework in which games' forms also speak to their place in a lived social landscape. At the same time, games bring a valuable tool set to queer and feminist studies. Games are systems. Whether they replicate, reflect, subvert, or reject hegemonic norms, they have the capacity to make visible the vectors of power that drive the machine of culture. The queerness found in games also suggests that gender, sexuality, and identity should be seen as meaningful elements of digital media across forms. Right? Expressions of the body and its desires are increasingly a matter of technology. Sexting, selfies, social networks. The body has a huge role to play in all of these spaces. But, for example, sexting is not just a cultural phenomenon, it's also a hardware phenomenon. Declaring a gender on Facebook is not just a question of communication, it's a question of computer-mediated communication. So this is a historical moment for games. From amidst the turmoil of harassment and controversy is arising a new vision for the future. It's a moment of change, and queer games are driving this change. However, the relationship between queerness and games is more than a vision of a brighter tomorrow. Truly uncovering the queerness in games means also looking back, looking under, looking inward, and looking closely. It means finding and embracing the queerness that has been here all along. Thank you.